There's a new trend in health and nutrition that has captured the public imagination and had plenty of airtime in recent years.
There's been a lot of debate around the world about ultra-processed foods.
Ultra-processed foods, the high in fats, starches, sugars and additives.
Homemade and free from UPF, that's food which has been ultra-processed.
Ultra-processed foods are the scary new food category that we're all being told we should avoid. But what if this idea that ultra-processed foods are necessarily unhealthy is a total myth? First, let's look at what ultra-processed foods actually are. Ultra-processed foods are those in category 4 of what's called the NOVA framework. Before you think that NOVA is an acronym for something scientific, it's not. It simply means new in Portuguese. The system was first invented in Brazil, and indeed it is pretty new. It was only invented in 2009. The definition of ultra-processed foods is a bit amorphous. Sometimes it has to do with having a certain number of ingredients, having ingredients that are difficult to pronounce, being wrapped in plastic, being produced by multinational companies, being profitable, being aggressively marketed, or being produced using methods that are not available in typical domestic settings. What it doesn't have to do with is health or nutrition. In fact, early definitions of ultra-processed foods were explicit in saying that this framework was not about nutrition and was not intended to be used as such. It's no wonder then that the USDA were able to design a diet which met all nutritional requirements and was made up of 91% ultra-processed foods. Think about it. Some of the foods being described here are pretty much the healthiest things that you can consume. Protein powder, ultra-processed food. Vitamin pills, ultra-processed food. Baked beans, whole grain bread, and even infant formula. These are all products which fall into this category called ultra-processed foods, but are by no metrics unhealthy. And there's one type of food in particular that has been heavily associated with this ultra-processed foods category, which is actually healthier than the food it replaces. I'm talking about plant-based meat. Despite their membership in the scary ultra-processed foods category, plant-based meat alternatives are on average healthier than the meat they replace. Let's look at a Beyond Burger for example. Compared to a Tesco beef burger, a Beyond Burger has 20% more fibre, 30% fewer calories, 41% less fat, and 68% less saturated fat. That means that it cuts down on the type of fat known to cause heart disease by more than 2/3. In a paper I wrote a couple of years ago, I caveated these advantages by saying that some plant-based meat products are lower in protein, iron, and B12, and that some could be higher in salt. So I was genuinely surprised when I found out that the Beyond Burger versus a beef burger won on all of these metrics too. Compared to Tesco beef burgers, Beyond Burgers are 19% lower in salt, 63% higher in B12, and contain over twice as much iron. Now, protein per 100 grams was slightly higher in the beef burger compared to the Beyond Burger, but the beef burgers contain so much fat that as a percentage of calories, protein was actually 22% higher in the Beyond Burger. This is pretty typical for a lot of plant-based meat products. They're very often lower in calorie density and lower in saturated fat whilst being higher in fibre. Even the caveats that I used to make about other nutrients are becoming less relevant as products reformulate and get healthier over time. It's no wonder that there are now randomized crossover trials showing that people lose weight and lower their LDL cholesterol levels when they eat plant-based meat instead of meat from animals. So why is there such a vibe that plant-based meat is unhealthy because it's ultra-processed? Well, it's simple. The meat industry paid for it. This is an actual advertisement run on behalf of the meat industry during the Super Bowl in 2020.
Can you please define that?
Methylcellulose. It's a chemical laxative that is also used in synthetic meat.
Subtle, right? And Super Bowl ads aren't cheap. The meat industry literally paid millions of dollars to indoctrinate us all into thinking that plant-based meat is ultra-processed and therefore unhealthy. As we've seen, in reality, the opposite is true. So ironically, this campaign, which appeals to fears about healthiness, is actually going to make the population less healthy. Fewer calories, less saturated fat, and more fibre are all things which would indisputably make the populations of developed countries healthier. Even occasionally swapping out meat for plant-based meat could significantly decrease the rate of obesity, heart disease, and other diseases associated with the overconsumption of calories and saturated fat. But wait, wasn't there that one study linking processed plant foods to higher risk of heart disease? Well, not exactly. In 2024, this study was published in the Lancet Regional Health, showing that consumption of processed plant foods was associated with an increased risk of heart disease. The media loved this story, and they were quick to run headlines about how vegan products are unhealthy because they're processed. The UK's Telegraph gleefully claimed that vegans are slowly killing themselves. Ouch. Except that's not what the study found. The study categorized foods into 4 groups: processed plant foods, unprocessed plant foods, processed animal foods, and unprocessed animal foods. They found that unprocessed plant foods decrease the risk of heart disease, but that processed plant foods increase the risk. They also found that both processed animal foods and unprocessed animal foods both increase the risk of heart disease, but the media largely ignored that part. The problem is that this category called processed plant foods was massive. It was the biggest food group in the study, making up 39% of the calories consumed, and it included foods like biscuits, pastries, even vodka. Now, considering how much the media covered this study as being all about plant-based meats, how much of that processed plant foods category do you think was actually made up from plant-based meat? Surely at least 10% of the calories? Nope. 5% of the calories? Nope. 2% of the calories? Try 1/2% of the calories in the processed plant foods category actually coming from plant-based meat. Meanwhile, 6 times that number were coming from quote-unquote industrial pizza. Do you think that it might be a bit unfair to group all of these things together and then cover this study as if it showed that plant-based meat was unhealthy? I think that it might be. Bizarrely, the fault in this coverage seems to originate with the university's press office. I don't know what prompted the press office to talk about plant-based meat in this press release, or to use this image, which, again, made up less than 1% of the calories in the study. Whatever the case, this study has been grievously misrepresented to suggest the opposite of what we know is true. In fact, substituting meat for plant-based alternatives reduces saturated fat, increases fiber, and reduces the risk of heart disease. As a category, ultra-processed food was never meant to be about health, but spurious science and meat industry-funded campaigns have made these associations very clear in the public imagination. If you look at any explanation of why ultra-processed foods are supposed to be unhealthy, you'll notice that it always cashes out in terms of nutrition or eating behavior. Ultra-processed foods are unhealthy because they're highly calorie-dense, or because they're high in sugar or high in salt or high in fat, or because they're hyperpalatable or have low hunger satiation. But what about those ultra-processed foods that are low in calorie density, low in fat, low in salt, low in sugar, high in fiber, highly satiating, and associated with better overall health outcomes? What about plant-based meat? Plant-based meat is healthier than meat from animals, but the meat industry has deliberately weaponized its categorization as an ultra-processed food to smear it as unhealthy. Don't fall for the meat industry propaganda. In reality, switching from meat to plant-based meat alternatives means consuming fewer calories, less saturated fat, and more fiber, which is going to reduce your risk of obesity and heart disease. This is Bryant, PhD. Cheers.